The catalyst for this story began on the morning of April 4, 2015, in North Charleston. A routine traffic stop had just taken place. The driver was Walter Scott, a 50-year-old forklift operator, driving through a residential neighborhood when a police cruiser signaled for him to pull over. The officer was Michael Slager, a patrol officer with the North Charleston Police Department. According to official records, the stop occurred because Scott's vehicle had a malfunctioning third brake light. At first, the interaction appeared routine. Within minutes, however, that ordinary stop would turn into a fatal shooting that sparked national attention and forced investigators to examine conflicting accounts about what happened during the encounter. The stop began shortly after 9:30 a.m. Dash camera footage from Slager's patrol car recorded the early moments of the encounter. Scott stepped out of his vehicle and spoke briefly with the officer. The conversation appeared calm at first. Then Scott suddenly ran from the scene. Investigators later considered several possible reasons why he fled. Scott had previously faced legal trouble related to unpaid child support, which had resulted in past arrests and warrants. Family members later said he may have panicked because of that history. His brother also explained that Scott had been driving to an auto parts store that morning and may simply have reacted impulsively when confronted by police. Whatever the reason, Scott ran across a nearby grassy lot, moving away from the roadside. Slager immediately pursued him on foot. The chase was brief and soon moved away from the road toward an open field near a patch of trees. At that point, the two men encountered each other again, and a physical confrontation occurred. During that struggle, Slager deployed his department-issued taser. Evidence later presented in court confirmed the device had been discharged. Slager's defense later argued that a struggle over the taser occurred during the confrontation. Forensic testing found that DNA from both men was presumptively present on the device, though experts testified that they could not determine which person was the major contributor or exactly how the DNA had been transferred to the taser. After the brief struggle, Scott broke free and began running again across the open field. What happened next happened rapidly. Slager drew his service weapon and fired 8 shots. 5 of those bullets struck Scott as he ran away. The autopsy later provided specific details about the wounds. 3 bullets entered through Scott's back, 1 entered through his upper buttocks, and another struck his ear. Forensic analysis also examined the distance between the two men as the shots were fired. Experts testified that the shooting began at a distance of approximately 18 feet. Because Scott continued running as the shots were fired, the distance increased during the sequence. By the time the 8th and final shot was fired, Scott was estimated to be about 40 feet away from the officer. Scott collapsed face down on the ground several yards away. Immediately after the shooting, Slager radioed dispatch and reported, "Shots fired and the subject is down. He grabbed my taser." That statement formed the basis of the officer's initial explanation. According to Slager's account, Scott had attempted to take control of the taser during the earlier struggle. Slager said he believed Scott could use the device against him and that he fired his weapon because he feared for his safety. In many police shootings, that explanation might have remained the dominant narrative, but this incident had an unexpected witness. Standing nearby was Fiden Santana, a local barber who had been walking through the neighborhood. From behind a fence several yards away, Santana began recording the encounter on his cell phone. The footage captured Scott running across the field and the moment Slager fired his weapon. After the gunfire stopped, the video continued recording. Scott lay motionless on the ground while Slager approached with his firearm drawn. The officer ordered Scott to place his hands behind his back. There was no response. The camera then recorded a sequence that would later become central to the investigation. Slager walked away from Scott's body toward the location where the earlier struggle had taken place. He bent down and picked up an object from the ground. The officer then walked back toward Scott and dropped the object beside the body. Investigators later identified the object as Slager's taser. Roughly 45 seconds later, the footage shows another detail often overlooked in shorter summaries of the case. Slager returned to the body, picked up the taser again, and placed it back into his holster. That brief sequence, retrieving the taser from the earlier struggle area, placing it near Scott's body, and later holstering it again, became one of the most closely examined moments in the investigation. For nearly 2 days, Santana kept the video private. He later explained that he feared retaliation if the footage became public. Eventually, he contacted Scott's family and shared the recording. Their attorney released the video to the media, and it quickly spread across television networks and social media. The footage immediately changed how the incident was viewed. What had initially been described in police reports as a justified use of force now appeared far more controversial when seen in the video. Authorities responded quickly. On April 7, 2015, only 3 days after the shooting, Slager was arrested and charged with murder. The investigation was transferred to the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, commonly known as SLED. Officials said the video evidence contradicted key aspects of the officer's original report. The case soon drew national attention. Federal investigators from the United States Department of Justice opened a civil rights investigation into whether Scott's constitutional rights had been violated. The state murder trial began in October 2016. Jurors repeatedly viewed Santana's cell phone video during testimony while hearing from investigators, forensic experts, and witnesses. Prosecutors argued that Scott had been running away and did not pose an immediate threat when the shots were fired. The defense argued that Slager believed Scott could still gain control of the taser and use it against him. After several days of deliberations, the jury was unable to reach a unanimous decision. In December 2016, the judge declared a mistrial. Despite the mistrial, the legal proceedings continued. Federal prosecutors pursued civil rights charges against Slager. In May 2017, he pleaded guilty to violating Walter Scott's civil rights by using excessive force. Later that year, the case reached its final stage in federal court. During sentencing, U.S. District Judge David Norton reviewed the evidence and the circumstances surrounding the shooting. Although Slager pleaded guilty to a civil rights violation, the judge determined that the conduct underlying the offense met the legal definition of second-degree murder, which significantly increased the sentencing range. On December 7, 2017, Slager was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. The second case. The Baltimore Gun Trace Task Force was created to remove illegal firearms from the streets of Baltimore. Inside the Baltimore Police Department, the small plainclothes unit was supposed to target violent offenders and recover illegal guns before they could be used in crimes. Their arrest numbers were high, and their reports showed frequent firearm recoveries. In a city dealing with persistent gun violence, the unit appeared to be delivering results. But by 2017, federal investigators would reveal that several members of that same unit had been committing crimes themselves. Officers were accused of robbing citizens during traffic stops, conducting illegal searches, falsifying police reports, and manipulating evidence. Among the most disturbing revelations was the discovery that officers had planted weapons, specifically BB guns or replica firearms, near suspects to justify police encounters or cover up misconduct. What began as a corruption investigation into theft and racketeering slowly exposed a deeper problem. Officers sworn to remove guns from the streets were sometimes creating the illusion of a weapon where none existed. The corruption case did not begin as an inquiry into police misconduct. Agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation were conducting a drug trafficking investigation when they obtained a wiretap connected to Mamoudou Gondo, a Baltimore police officer assigned to the Gun Trace Task Force. While listening to those calls, investigators began hearing conversations unrelated to narcotics. Instead, officers appeared to be discussing robberies during police operations. In some conversations, they talked about seizing money during traffic stops and dividing the cash among themselves. Those recordings triggered a broader federal investigation. Agents began reviewing financial records, police reports, and citizen complaints. Several individuals described encounters with plainclothes officers who stopped them, searched them, and removed money that never appeared in official evidence logs. At first, each complaint appeared to be a separate incident, but when investigators began comparing the records, they noticed striking similarities. Police reports used the same language to explain encounters. Officers repeatedly claimed suspects had reached for a weapon or attempted to flee. The explanations appeared again and again across different cases. As investigators dug deeper, cooperating officers began describing how the unit actually operated. Some members admitted that illegal searches and robberies were common during street stops. Money taken during these encounters was often divided among officers. But another revelation emerged during testimony. Several cooperating witnesses said members of the unit sometimes carried BB guns or replica firearms in their vehicles. According to testimony later given in federal court by Officer Morris Ward, the purpose of those weapons was simple. If officers were involved in a shooting or violent encounter with an unarmed person, the replica gun could be placed near the suspect. The presence of a weapon would support the officer's written report that the suspect had been armed. In other words, the weapon could transform an unarmed encounter into one that appeared justified. One of the most clearly documented incidents involving planted weapons occurred in 2014. According to federal court records, Gun Trace Task Force Supervisor Wayne Jenkins pursued a suspect during a police chase. During that pursuit, Jenkins ran over the suspect with his vehicle, seriously injuring him. Investigators later determined that Jenkins did not have a legal reason to chase the man in the first place. The situation created a serious problem for the officers involved. To justify the encounter, officers decided to place a weapon at the scene. Keith Gladstone, a police sergeant connected to the unit, later admitted in federal court that he planted a BB gun near the crash scene. The fake weapon created the appearance that the suspect had been armed. Gladstone later pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 21 months in federal prison for the scheme. Federal prosecutors concluded that the weapon had been planted specifically to protect Jenkins from scrutiny. The investigation into the planted BB gun revealed that multiple officers had participated in the scheme. Detective Robert Hankard was later convicted in 2022 and sentenced to 30 months in federal prison for providing the BB gun used in the incident. Prosecutors also showed that Hankard had falsified a search warrant and lied to a federal grand jury during the investigation. Another officer, Carmine Vignola, was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison after admitting that he lied to a federal grand jury about the gun planting incident. Wayne Jenkins himself later admitted to requesting the BB gun used in the scheme. Although Jenkins had already been sentenced to 25 years in prison for racketeering and robbery connected to the Gun Trace Task Force, prosecutors also linked him to the weapon planting conspiracy. Investigators also uncovered a separate 2010 incident in which Jenkins was accused of planting heroin inside a suspect's vehicle to justify an arrest. The broader corruption case against the Gun Trace Task Force began publicly in March 2017 when federal prosecutors from the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Maryland announced sweeping indictments against members of the unit. Officers, including Wayne Jenkins, Daniel Hersel, Jamel Rayam, Marcus Taylor, Mamoudou Gondo, Thomas Allers, Evodio Hendricks, and Maurice Ward, were charged with racketeering, robbery, and falsifying police reports. Over the course of the investigation, the corruption scandal expanded. Ultimately, approximately 12 to 13 individuals connected to the scheme were convicted as prosecutors uncovered additional participants and related misconduct. The trial of several officers began in January 2018. Prosecutors presented wiretap recordings, financial records, and testimony from victims and cooperating officers. Witnesses described encounters in which officers searched them without cause and seized large amounts of cash that were never documented. By mid-2018, federal courts began issuing sentences. Wayne Jenkins, 25 years in federal prison. Daniel Hersel, 18 years. Jamel Rayam, 12 years. Mamoudou Gondo, 10 years. Other officers also received prison sentences for their roles in the corruption scheme. The third case. On the morning of September 4, 2005, officers from the New Orleans Police Department opened fire on civilians crossing the Danziger Bridge in New Orleans. 6 unarmed civilians were shot. 2 of them, 17-year-old James Brissett and 40-year-old Ronald Madison, were killed. 4 others were severely wounded. In the hours that followed, official police reports described the shooting as a confrontation with armed suspects. Officers stated that they had been ambushed and forced to return fire. For a time, that explanation shaped the early understanding of the incident. But over the next decade, investigators would uncover evidence that the victims had been unarmed and that the official narrative had been constructed through false reports, fabricated witnesses, and planted evidence. To understand how the events took place, the story can be examined through a parallel encounter structure, 2 groups moving toward the same location under entirely different assumptions. In the first sequence, residents of eastern New Orleans are navigating the city 6 days after Hurricane Katrina devastated large parts of the region. Floodwaters have destroyed homes, food is scarce, and many residents are trying to move across the city on foot in search of help. Among the group walking across the bridge that morning are members of the Bartholomew family and Ronald Madison, a developmentally disabled man traveling with his brother, Lance Madison. The civilians are simply attempting to cross the bridge toward areas where assistance might be available. None of them are armed. At the same time, a second sequence occurs across police radio channels. Officers receive a report that police have been fired upon near the bridge. In the chaotic aftermath of Katrina, Rumors of snipers and armed gangs spread rapidly across the city. Officers responding to the call believe they are heading into a dangerous situation. A team of officers drives toward the bridge in response. They are not traveling in marked patrol cars. Instead, they arrive in a budget rental truck, a detail that contributes to confusion among civilians on the bridge who do not immediately recognize the vehicle as belonging to police. The two sequences converge when the truck reaches the bridge. When officers exit the truck on the east side of the bridge, gunfire erupts almost immediately. Witnesses later testify that civilians are caught off guard by the sudden shooting. People attempt to run in different directions or take cover behind concrete barriers. During this first burst of gunfire, James Brissett is struck by police bullets and dies on the bridge. Several members of the Bartholomew family are also hit. Susan Bartholomew suffers catastrophic injuries to her arm. Other civilians are wounded during the same volley of shots. The gunfire on the east side of the bridge lasts only moments, but the encounter continues as the scene shifts across the bridge. The incident then moves to a second location on the west side of the bridge. Ronald Madison begins running away from the shooting. As he flees toward a nearby motel, he is struck in the back by a shotgun blast fired by police. The blast sends him collapsing onto the pavement. Officers pursue him as he lies wounded. Federal testimony later reveals that Madison was kicked and stomped by an officer while he lay dying on the ground. Madison dies from multiple gunshot wounds. By the time the shooting ends, 6 civilians have been struck by police gunfire. 2 are dead. After the shooting stops, officers begin documenting their version of events. The official reports describe a gun battle in which police were ambushed by armed suspects. According to the narrative recorded in those reports, officers had been forced to return fire to defend themselves. Statements describe suspects carrying weapons and firing at police. Some reports also mention witnesses who allegedly observed suspects shooting at officers. For a time, the explanation receives little scrutiny. In the chaotic environment following Hurricane Katrina, emergency services across New Orleans are overwhelmed and investigative resources are limited. But survivors of the shooting begin telling a different story. They insist that no one in their group had been armed and that civilians had been trying to flee when the gunfire started. Their accounts eventually drew the attention of federal investigators. Years later, the United States Department of Justice launches a civil rights investigation into several police incidents that occurred in New Orleans. Investigators review ballistic evidence, interview witnesses, and examine the reports written by officers after the shooting. The findings begin to reveal major contradictions. Ballistics analysis shows that the gunfire on the bridge came from police weapons. Investigators find no credible evidence that civilians had fired on officers. Witness testimony repeatedly confirms that the victims had been unarmed. Investigators also uncovered evidence that the official narrative had been deliberately constructed. After the shooting, several officers met privately to coordinate their accounts. Testimony later reveals that officers discussed what they would say to investigators. Reports referenced witnesses who did not exist. Evidence presented during the investigation indicated that a handgun had been planted at the scene to support the claim that suspects had been armed. Federal prosecutors later described these actions as part of a conspiracy to obstruct justice. In 2010, federal prosecutors indicted several officers connected to the shooting and the cover-up. The charges included civil rights violations, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. The trial revealed details about both the shooting and the events that followed. Jurors heard testimony about how officers coordinated statements and created reports that investigators later determined were false. In August 2011, a federal jury convicted multiple officers involved in the case. In 2012, a federal judge imposed lengthy prison sentences, with some officers receiving terms ranging from 6 years to 65 years. The legal process changed dramatically in 2013 when a federal judge vacated those convictions. The ruling followed the discovery that prosecutors involved in the case had posted anonymous online comments about the trial while it was ongoing. The judge concluded that this misconduct could have influenced the jury process, meaning the verdicts could not stand. Rather than repeat the lengthy trial, federal prosecutors negotiated plea agreements with the officers involved. In 2016, several former officers pleaded guilty to reduced federal charges related to the cover-up and civil rights violations connected to the shooting. These plea agreements resulted in shorter prison sentences than those originally imposed after the 2011 convictions, but they formally established that officers had participated in falsifying reports and obstructing justice following the shooting. Fourth case. Jamar Lewis was 22 years old in 2004 when Chicago police arrested him in the Ida B. Wells public housing complex, a neighborhood on the city's south side. Officers reported that they had discovered illegal narcotics in his possession during a patrol encounter. According to the official account, the arrest followed a search in which police recovered drugs that prosecutors later used as the key evidence in court. Lewis insisted from the beginning that the narcotics did not belong to him. He told the court that officers had planted the drugs during the arrest, but in criminal trials, such claims are difficult to prove. Without video recordings, independent witnesses, or forensic contradictions, juries often rely on the credibility of police testimony. In Lewis's case, the officer's account prevailed. He was convicted, and for years his case looked like one more routine drug conviction processed through Chicago's criminal courts. The officers who arrested Lewis worked under Chicago Police Sergeant Ronald Watts, who supervised a tactical team assigned to patrol the Ida B. Wells housing development. Residents in the area had long complained about the conduct of Watts and members of his unit. Community members described a pattern of encounters in which officers stopped individuals they suspected of selling drugs and demanded cash payments. According to residents, those who paid were often allowed to continue operating, while those who refused sometimes found themselves arrested soon afterward on narcotics charges. For years, these complaints circulated largely within the neighborhood and rarely produced formal investigations. Police reports from the arrests continued to describe routine patrol operations in which drugs were discovered during searches. The narrative surrounding these arrests began to shift dramatically in 2012, when federal investigators uncovered evidence that confirmed corruption within the unit. The turning point came through an FBI sting operation involving a confidential informant posing as a drug dealer. During the operation, the informant handed $5,200 in cash to Sergeant Ronald Watts, who took the money instead of processing it as evidence. Federal prosecutors later revealed that Watts and another officer had been running a scheme in which they extorted money from drug dealers in the neighborhood. In exchange for the payments, the officers allowed those dealers to operate without interference from police patrols. In 2013, Watts pleaded guilty in federal court to corruption charges and was sentenced to 22 months in prison. Once that conviction became public, it immediately cast doubt on numerous cases connected to the officers who had worked under Watts's supervision. When a police officer is convicted of crimes involving dishonesty, prosecutors must reconsider whether that officer's testimony can still be trusted in other cases. Defense attorneys quickly began reviewing arrests tied to the Watts tactical team. As they examined those files, they noticed a striking pattern. Many defendants arrested by the same officers had made the same claim during their trials. They insisted the drugs used to charge them had never been in their possession before the police encounter. This stage of the investigation represents the shift toward the evidence discrepancy structure, where investigators begin comparing officer accounts with physical evidence, witness testimony, and patterns across multiple cases. Attorneys and journalists started examining police reports, court transcripts, and statements from residents who had witnessed arrests in the Ida B. Wells neighborhood. In several cases, discrepancies began to emerge between what officers had written in official reports and what witnesses later described. Police reports frequently stated that officers discovered narcotics during routine patrol stops or quick street searches. Yet some residents described encounters that unfolded differently. Witnesses sometimes recalled officers detaining individuals without immediately finding any contraband. In other situations, the timeline described in police reports did not match the sequence of events remembered by people who had seen the arrest occur. These differences did not automatically prove that evidence had been planted, but when investigators began seeing the same contradictions appear repeatedly across multiple cases tied to the same officers, the similarities became increasingly difficult to ignore. Legal advocacy organizations soon joined the review process. Groups dedicated to examining wrongful convictions began analyzing cases connected to the Watts unit. Their investigations revealed that many of the convictions relied heavily on officer testimony rather than independent physical evidence. The drugs used to support the charges had been logged into police inventories, but the officers themselves were often the only witnesses who claimed to have discovered them. If those officers had engaged in corruption, the reliability of the evidence they collected could no longer be assumed. The case of Jamar Lewis became one of the examples examined during this broader review. His conviction depended on the testimony of officers connected to the Watts unit. After the corruption investigation exposed misconduct within that group, attorneys argued that the credibility of those officers had been irreparably compromised. Courts eventually agreed to reconsider several cases linked to the unit. In 2017, prosecutors acknowledged that Lewis's conviction could not be defended in light of the corruption uncovered in the investigation. His conviction was vacated, and he received a certificate of innocence, formally recognizing that he had been wrongfully convicted. Lewis's exoneration marked only one chapter in a much larger legal reckoning. As investigators continued examining arrests tied to the Watts unit, courts began dismissing additional convictions connected to the same officers. One case after another fell apart as prosecutors acknowledged that the credibility of the officers involved had been undermined by the corruption scandal. By late 2024, at least 226 convictions connected to Ronald Watts and his team had been dismissed. Many of those cases involved drug arrests made in the Ida B. Wells neighborhood during the years when Watts supervised the unit. The legal consequences extended far beyond the criminal cases themselves. Many of the individuals whose convictions were overturned filed civil lawsuits against the city of Chicago, arguing that they had spent years in prison because of fabricated evidence and police misconduct. These lawsuits accumulated over time, creating one of the most costly police corruption scandals in the city's history. In 2025, Chicago officials approved a $90 million global settlement to resolve approximately 176 lawsuits filed by victims of the Watts unit. When combined with earlier settlements and the legal costs associated with the scandal, the total financial impact on taxpayers has been estimated at more than $126 million. For Jamar Lewis, the story did not end with his exoneration. After receiving his certificate of innocence in 2017 and attempting to rebuild his life, he was arrested again in 2018 on unrelated federal drug charges. That later arrest was separate from the corruption scandal and did not change the court's finding that his earlier conviction had been wrongful. Still, the development added another complicated chapter to a case that had already become part of a larger investigation into police misconduct. Fifth case. The Rampart district of Los Angeles was one of the city's most heavily policed neighborhoods in the mid-1990s. Dense apartment blocks, aging buildings, and a strong presence of street gangs made the area a constant focus of gang enforcement operations. On the night of October 12, 1996, inside a vacant apartment building in this neighborhood, a confrontation occurred that would later become one of the most controversial incidents connected to the Los Angeles Police Department. Inside the building was Javier Ovando, a 19-year-old immigrant from Honduras who had been living in Los Angeles. According to later court records, Ovando had associations with the 18th Street Gang, one of the largest gangs operating in the city at the time. That association would later become an important part of how prosecutors portrayed him in court. Two LAPD officers entered the building that night while on patrol, Rafael Perez and Nino Durden. Both officers were members of the department's anti-gang unit known as CRASH, short for Community Resources Against Street Hoodlums. The unit was designed to aggressively target gang activity in neighborhoods like Rampart. Moments after the officers encountered Ovando inside the building, gunfire erupted. When the shooting stopped, Ovando had been struck multiple times. The injuries left him permanently paralyzed from the waist down. The officers immediately reported that the shooting had occurred during a violent struggle. According to their statements, Ovando had attacked them and attempted to grab one of their firearms. They claimed they opened fire in self-defense. Investigators reported that a handgun had been recovered near Ovando at the scene. That detail became the foundation of the official account. Within hours, police reports described the incident as a justified use of force against an armed suspect. The presence of the handgun reinforced the officers' claims that Ovando had been dangerous and aggressive during the encounter. Despite suffering devastating injuries, Ovando was arrested and charged with assault on a police officer. The case quickly moved into the criminal justice system. During the 1997 trial, prosecutors relied heavily on the testimony of Perez and Durden. The handgun recovered at the scene was presented as key evidence supporting their claim that Ovando had attacked them. Ovando's alleged gang affiliation also became a central part of the prosecution's narrative. His connection to the 18th Street Gang was emphasized in court to portray him as a violent criminal capable of confronting police officers. The argument presented to the jury was clear. Officers had encountered a dangerous gang member who attempted to attack them, and they responded with lawful force. In February 1997, the jury found Ovando guilty. He was sentenced to 23 years and 4 months in prison. At that moment, the official record of the incident appeared settled. The shooting had been ruled justified, the officer's testimony had been accepted, and the suspect had been convicted. But the case would soon collapse in a way no one anticipated. Less than 2 years later, an unrelated investigation inside the Rampart division would expose one of the largest police corruption scandals in American history. In August 1998, Officer Rafael Perez was arrested after investigators discovered cocaine had been stolen from an LAPD evidence locker. The arrest triggered a major internal investigation within the Rampart division. As detectives examined the evidence theft, they began uncovering signs of deeper misconduct within the division's crash unit. Facing serious criminal charges, Perez eventually agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. During extensive interviews in 1999, Perez began describing widespread corruption within the unit. The allegations included falsified police reports, planted evidence, unjustified shootings, and fabricated testimony used in criminal prosecutions. Among the cases Perez admitted falsifying was the shooting of Javier Ovando. According to Perez's confession, the official story presented in court was not true. Perez told investigators that Ovando had not attacked the officers and had not been armed. He admitted that he had shot Ovando during the encounter. After realizing the shooting could not be justified, Perez said he and Durden planted a handgun at the scene to create the appearance that Ovando had been armed. The officers then wrote police reports and testified in court, claiming that Ovando had tried to grab a gun. That false narrative became the foundation of the criminal case that sent Ovando to prison. During the investigation that followed, Ovando provided his own account of what had happened inside the building. He told investigators that he had been handcuffed before the shooting and that Perez held him upright before firing the shots. Perez admitted to the shooting and the planted weapon, but never confirmed that Ovando had been restrained beforehand. The allegation remains one of the most disputed aspects of the case. Once Perez's confession became known, prosecutors quickly reviewed Ovando's conviction. Without the officer's testimony and the planted weapon, the prosecution's case collapsed. In September 1999, Ovando's conviction was overturned. By that time, he had spent more than 2 years in prison for a crime he had never committed. The revelation became one of the most dramatic developments in what became known as the Rampart scandal. The investigation soon expanded beyond the Ovando case. Perez's cooperation led investigators to review hundreds of arrests and prosecutions involving officers from the Rampart Division's crash unit. As courts began examining those cases, the scale of the misconduct became clear. More than 100 criminal convictions linked to Rampart officers were eventually overturned after judges determined that testimony and evidence from the unit could not be trusted. The scandal also triggered sweeping scrutiny of the Los Angeles Police Department. Federal authorities launched investigations into the department's practices, and the LAPD was eventually placed under a federal consent decree, which remained in place for more than a decade and required major reforms to oversight and accountability. For Javier Ovando, the legal reversal could not undo the physical consequences of the shooting. The gunshot wounds he suffered in 1996 left him permanently paralyzed. Civil courts later addressed the case. In November 2000, the city of Los Angeles agreed to pay $15 million to settle Ovando's civil rights lawsuit. At the time, it was one of the largest police misconduct settlements in the city's history. The sixth case begins. The story of Anthony Lamar Smith began with a version of events that seemed simple. On December 20, 2011, officers from the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department believed they had witnessed a drug transaction in a parking lot in North St. Louis. When officers moved in, Smith, a 24-year-old man driving a sedan, sped away. A police SUV carrying Officer Jason Stockley and his partner followed him through nearby streets. Dash camera video captured the pursuit as the vehicles raced through intersections and residential blocks. During the chase, Stockley was seen holding a personally owned AK-47 style pistol, a weapon not authorized under department policy. As the pursuit unfolded, the microphone inside the patrol SUV recorded Stockley speaking. His voice can be heard saying, "Going to kill this mother, don't you know it?" Moments later, the chase came to a sudden stop near West Florissant Avenue, where the police vehicle forced Smith's car to halt. The confrontation that followed lasted only seconds. After the vehicle stopped, Stockley ran toward the driver's side of Smith's car. According to investigators and trial testimony, he fired 5 shots through the driver's side window, killing Smith inside the vehicle. Some summaries of the trial also noted that Stockley had fired earlier during the chase as the car sped away, though the fatal shots occurred during the final encounter after the vehicle stopped. Police reported that Smith had been reaching for a weapon inside the car. Officers recovered a .38 caliber revolver from the vehicle, and the presence of that gun was initially presented as the reason lethal force had been used. For several years, that explanation remained the dominant account of what had happened during the short pursuit in North St. Louis. But as investigators and prosecutors began reviewing the evidence more closely, several details began to challenge that narrative. The dash camera recording revealed Stockley's statement during the chase, a remark prosecutors later argued suggested intent before the shooting occurred. At the same time, forensic testing of the revolver recovered from Smith's car produced an unexpected result. DNA analysis detected only Jason Stockley's DNA on the weapon, with none belonging to Anthony Lamar Smith. Prosecutors argued that this raised the possibility the gun had been placed in the vehicle after the shooting. Video footage also captured Stockley returning briefly to the police SUV after the shooting and searching through a bag before walking back to Smith's car. Prosecutors suggested this movement could have been when the revolver was retrieved and placed in the vehicle. Stockley gave a different explanation when he testified in court, stating that he had been looking for medical equipment in the bag. As these pieces of evidence came together, the official narrative surrounding the shooting began to shift. Nearly 5 years after Smith's death, prosecutors filed charges. In May 2016, the St. Louis Circuit Attorney's Office charged Stockley with first-degree murder, arguing that the officer had planted the revolver in Smith's car to justify the shooting. The case moved to trial in 2017 before Timothy Wilson in the 22nd Judicial Circuit Court of Missouri. Prosecutors presented the dash camera recording, forensic evidence from the revolver, and testimony about Stockley's movements after the shooting. Defense attorneys argued that Smith had possessed the gun and that the officer's actions were consistent with someone responding to a dangerous situation during a pursuit. On September 15, 2017, Judge Wilson delivered the verdict. Jason Stockley was found not guilty of first-degree murder. In his written ruling, the judge stated that the prosecution had not proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Stockley planted the gun or intentionally killed Smith without justification. The decision also included a controversial observation. The judge wrote that an urban heroin dealer not in possession of a firearm would be an anomaly, which he cited when explaining why he believed it was plausible Smith had been armed despite the absence of Smith's DNA on the revolver. We now turn to the 7th case. Derek Ridgewell served as a detective sergeant with the British Transport Police in London during the early 1970s. His assignment focused on robberies taking place across the London Underground network. At the time, officials were under pressure to respond to rising fears about violent crime on trains and station platforms. Ridgewell became known as an officer who consistently produced arrests. In courtroom after courtroom, he described confrontations with suspects whom he said were involved in robberies or attempted robberies on the Underground. Prosecutors frequently relied on his testimony, particularly when he claimed weapons or stolen property had been discovered during searches. Many defendants accused in these cases were young black men from South London. Judges and juries often accepted the officer's evidence, and several men were convicted. For the public, the cases appeared to confirm that police had successfully dismantled groups responsible for violent crime on the railway. The story shifts when the documentary introduces the individuals whose lives were changed by those arrests. In February 1972, 6 young men were detained following an incident on a train near Stockwell Station. Ridgewell claimed that the group had attempted to rob him while he was traveling undercover. The prosecution presented the case as proof of organized criminal activity targeting passengers. The trial resulted in 5 convictions. The case became known as the Stockwell 6 case. Families recall the shock that followed the verdicts. Young men who had been students or early in their working lives were suddenly labeled violent offenders and sent to prison. For those convicted, the consequences extended beyond the time spent behind bars. Criminal records affected employment opportunities and reputations long after the sentences ended. As the investigative narrative continues, attention turns toward Ridgewell himself. By the late 1970s, authorities began investigating a separate scheme involving theft from railway mailbags passing through the transport network. The investigation uncovered that Ridgewell had been involved in stealing from postal trains while serving as a police officer. In 1980, he was convicted of conspiracy to steal and sentenced to 7 years in prison. The revelation changed how earlier cases connected to his work were viewed. If a detective whose testimony had sent numerous people to prison had been engaged in criminal activity while serving as an officer, the reliability of the evidence he presented in court became deeply questionable. The film then returns to the people whose convictions depended on that testimony. For decades, many of them had insisted that the accusations were false. Lawyers and campaigners began reviewing trial transcripts and police records from Ridgewell's investigations. Their efforts eventually reached the Criminal Cases Review Commission, which has the authority to investigate possible miscarriages of justice. The commission examined witness statements, evidence logs, and the court proceedings in which Ridgewell had testified. Each stage of the review process renewed attention on the individuals who had carried criminal convictions for nearly half a century. Interviews and archival footage reveal how those convictions affected their lives, shaping careers, relationships, and opportunities. Nearly 50 years after the original arrests, the cases returned to court. In 2021, the Court of Appeal of England and Wales examined several convictions connected to the Stockwell 6 case. The judges concluded that the prosecution had relied heavily on the testimony of Derek Ridgewell, whose later criminal conviction weakened the credibility of the evidence presented at the trial. Because of that finding, several of the convictions were overturned. Further appeals followed. In 2022, additional members of the group had their convictions quashed. However, the final man connected to the case did not receive the same ruling until 2025, when the Court of Appeal finally cleared his name. For the men involved and their families, the legal process lasted more than 5 decades. Several other cases connected to his work have since been overturned. One involved 4 young men known as the Oval 4 case, who were convicted in 1972 after Ridgewell claimed they had attempted to rob him on the Underground. Decades later, the Court of Appeal ruled that their convictions were unsafe. Other groups later linked to Ridgewell's investigations included the Waterloo 4 case and the Tottenham Court Road 2 case, where similar allegations of fabricated evidence and unreliable testimony emerged during legal reviews. Former defendants described the experience of entering prison while maintaining their innocence. Family members recount the years spent supporting appeals and challenging the convictions. In some instances, the men who were originally convicted did not live to see their names cleared. Relatives attended court hearings decades later to hear judges acknowledge that the trials had been compromised. Derek Ridgewell himself died in prison in 1982, long before the full extent of the damage connected to his investigations became clear. Yet the cases he built continued to influence lives long after his death. The 8 case. In June 1970, the quiet farming community of Pukakawa in the Waikato region of New Zealand became the center of a tragedy that would grow into one of the most controversial criminal investigations in the country's history. Harvey Crew and his wife, Jeanette Crew, lived on a rural farm surrounded by open fields and scattered homesteads. Around June 17, 1970, both were killed inside their farmhouse. Each had been shot in the head with a .22 caliber rifle. When relatives later arrived at the property after several days without contact, they found the house empty. But one detail made the discovery even more unsettling. The couple's infant daughter, Rochelle Crew, was still inside the home. Rochelle had been alone for days. When she was discovered, she was weak and dehydrated but alive. For years, speculation circulated about how the child managed to survive. Some theories suggested someone may have entered the home after the murders to feed her. However, a modern police review conducted in 2014 examined Rochelle's condition and concluded that such a scenario was unlikely. Investigators determined that the infant's condition was consistent with a child of her age surviving for several days if small amounts of liquid were available inside the house. While the finding clarified one lingering mystery of the crime scene, it did nothing to answer the central question: who killed Harvey and Jeanette Crew? The investigation quickly expanded across the surrounding region. Weeks later, the case took a grim turn. On August 16, 1970, Jeanette Crew's body was discovered in the Waikato River. Exactly 1 month later, on September 16th, Harvey Crew's body was recovered from the same river. Post-mortem examinations confirmed both victims had been shot with a .22 caliber firearm before their bodies were disposed of in the water. The brutality of the crime shocked New Zealand and intensified pressure on police to identify a suspect. Eventually, investigators focused on a nearby farmer named Arthur Allen Thomas. Thomas lived close to the Crew property and was known in the local farming community. Detectives leading the investigation included Detective Inspector Bruce Hutton and Detective Sergeant Lenrick Johnston. As police constructed their case, they claimed to have discovered a crucial piece of evidence linking Thomas directly to the murders. That evidence was a single spent .22 cartridge case discovered near the Crew farmhouse. According to investigators, ballistic analysis showed the casing had been fired from Thomas's rifle. The cartridge became one of the most important pieces of evidence in the prosecution's case. During the trial in August 1971, prosecutors argued that the casing demonstrated Thomas had fired the fatal shots. After hearing the evidence, the jury convicted him of murdering Harvey and Jeanette Crew. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. From the beginning, however, the conviction raised serious concerns. Thomas maintained his innocence, and questions began emerging about the reliability of the evidence used against him. Critics pointed particularly to the cartridge case. Doubts centered on when it had actually been discovered and why it had not appeared during the earliest searches of the crime scene. Despite these concerns, Thomas remained imprisoned. In 1973, an appeal resulted in a second trial. The prosecution again relied heavily on the cartridge evidence, and once again Thomas was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. Over time, scrutiny of the case intensified. Journalists, legal experts, and supporters began examining the investigation more closely. Their efforts eventually led to the establishment of a Royal Commission of Inquiry in 1979 to review the case in detail. The commission re-examined witness testimony, police records, and forensic evidence. One exhibit quickly became the focus of the inquiry: the cartridge case presented during both trials, known as Exhibit 350. Forensic analysis revealed a crucial problem. The ammunition used in Exhibit 350 was a different pattern of .22 cartridge than the ammunition that had fired the fatal shots that killed Harvey and Jeanette Crew. This meant the casing could not have been one of the shells used in the murders. The commission concluded that the cartridge had likely been fired from Thomas's rifle at a later time, and then placed at the crime scene months after the killings. The Royal Commission determined that the cartridge had been planted during the investigation. Its findings strongly criticized the handling of the evidence by the investigators involved in the case, particularly Detective Inspector Bruce Hutton and Detective Sergeant Lenrick Johnston. The discovery that the key piece of evidence had been fabricated fundamentally weakened the prosecution's case. The consequences were immediate. In December 1979, after nearly 9 years in prison, Arthur Allen Thomas received a full royal pardon from the Governor-General of New Zealand. He was released and later received financial compensation for the wrongful conviction. The case became one of the most famous miscarriages of justice in New Zealand history. Even after the pardon, however, the Crew murders themselves remained unsolved. Over the decades, investigators continued examining the physical evidence collected during the original investigation. A comprehensive police review completed in 2014 reaffirmed the conclusion that the cartridge evidence had been planted and that Thomas had been wrongfully convicted. The review also examined other items that investigators had once believed might connect the Thomas farm to the crime. One of those items was a metal axle used to weigh down one of the bodies found in the Waikato River. Earlier theories suggested that the axle might have come from equipment on the Thomas farm. However, the 2014 review determined that this connection could not be confirmed. Investigators described it only as a distinct possibility, not a verified link between the farm and the crime. More recently, additional investigative work has raised further doubts about the axle theory. In 2023, journalists Kirsty Johnston and James Hollings examined the evidence again while researching the case. Their investigation suggested that the axle recovered from the river may have been a different model from the one owned by Arthur Allen Thomas. If correct, this would weaken one of the remaining pieces of circumstantial evidence that had once been considered potentially significant. Case 9. Boddington is a quiet rural town in Western Australia, surrounded by bushland and farmland about 120 kilometers southeast of Perth. In December 2007, that quiet setting became the center of a murder investigation that would later shake confidence in the criminal justice system. The victim was Stacy Thorne, a 22-year-old woman who was pregnant at the time of her death. She lived locally and was known in the small community. When she was found fatally stabbed near her home, investigators from the Western Australia Police Force began searching the surrounding bush tracks for clues. What they discovered during those searches would later become the foundation of a murder conviction. But years later, courts would revisit those discoveries and raise serious questions about whether some of the most important evidence in the case had been planted. During the early investigation, police searched a bush track located between the homes of Stacy Thorne and a man named Scott Ostick. Ostick lived nearby and had known Thorne before the attack. Investigators soon began focusing on him as the primary suspect. During the searches, police reported finding several key pieces of evidence. One of the most important items was a knife discovered along the track, which investigators believed could be the murder weapon. Other objects were also recovered. A cigarette packet containing Thorne's blood was found at Ostick's property, and a Jim Beam bourbon can containing Ostick's DNA was located near the area where the attack occurred. When prosecutors presented the case in court, these items formed the central narrative of the investigation. According to the prosecution, the objects created a clear path linking Ostick directly to the crime scene. The argument convinced jurors. In 2009, Scott Ostick was convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 25 years. At the time of the conviction, the evidence appeared straightforward. The knife suggested the weapon used in the attack. The cigarette packet connected the victim's blood to Ostick's property. The bourbon can placed him near the scene. Together, the items created a powerful sequence of physical proof. Yet over the years that followed, Ostick continued to maintain that he was innocent. From prison, his legal team began filing appeals and reviewing the case file in detail. As lawyers examined the investigation more closely, new questions started to appear. The knife, which had been presented as the murder weapon, quickly became one of the most disputed elements in the case. Records showed that volunteers from the State Emergency Service had searched the same bush track the day before the knife was discovered and had reported seeing nothing there. That raised an immediate question. How could such a crucial piece of evidence appear in a location that had already been searched? At the same time, the cigarette packet that contained Thorne's blood began attracting scrutiny. Lawyers reviewing the case examined photographs and video recordings taken during the original investigation. Those records appeared to show that the cigarette packet was not visible in earlier footage but appeared later in the evidence photographs. The Jim Beam can was also reconsidered as investigators revisited the timeline of how each item had been discovered. Each of these issues formed a separate investigative thread. One thread focused on search procedures, another examined the documentation of evidence. A third involved the forensic interpretation of the weapon itself. For years, these concerns developed independently as courts reviewed different aspects of the case. Eventually, those threads came together when the case reached the Western Australian Court of Appeal. During the appellate review, the court examined new expert testimony along with the original trial evidence. One of the most significant developments came from forensic pathologist Dr. Richard Shepard, who analyzed the injuries suffered by Stacy Thorne. After reviewing the wounds, he concluded that the knife presented at trial might not have been capable of causing them. That finding intersected directly with the earlier questions about how the knife had been discovered. When the court reviewed the knife alongside the issues surrounding the cigarette packet and other physical items, the investigation began to look very different from the story that had been presented to the jury in 2009. In 2020, the judges concluded that there was credible, cogent, and plausible evidence suggesting that the knife and other items linking Ostick to the murder may have been planted. The court did not determine who might have placed those items at the scene. Instead, the judges concluded that the possibility could not be ruled out and that the original jury had not heard information that might have changed the outcome of the trial. The Court of Appeal quashed Ostick's conviction and ordered a retrial. By that time, he had already spent 12 years and 7 months in prison for the murder of Stacy Thorne. The retrial began later in 2020, with jurors hearing many of the same questions that had led the appellate court to intervene. Defense lawyers focused heavily on the timeline of the search that had failed to locate the knife the day before it was discovered. They highlighted the discrepancies in the photographic record of the cigarette packet. They also presented the forensic testimony suggesting the knife may not have matched the fatal wounds. The prosecution attempted to reconstruct the events of the crime, but the reliability of the physical evidence was now the central issue. When the retrial concluded in November 2020, the jury reached its verdict quickly. After deliberating for roughly 2 hours, jurors returned a verdict of not guilty. Scott Ostick was acquitted of the murder of Stacy Thorne and released from custody. The decision ended more than a decade of imprisonment for a crime the jury determined he had not committed. The story did not end there. In 2023, the Western Australian government acknowledged the consequences of the wrongful conviction by granting Ostick an ex gratia compensation payment of $1.6 million. The payment did not determine who might have planted the evidence or explain how the items appeared at the scene, but it recognized the years he had spent in prison after a conviction that was later overturned. Now, to the 10th and final case. The most contested piece of evidence in the shooting of Graeme Russell Jensen was a sawn-off .22 caliber rifle discovered inside his car after police opened fire. According to the official police account, the weapon explained why detectives from the Victoria Police Armed Robbery Squad fired their guns on the 11th of October 1988 in Narre Warren, a suburb southeast of Melbourne. Officers stated they believed Jensen was armed and posed an immediate threat during the attempted arrest. But in the years that followed, the rifle itself became the center of a major controversy. Former detectives later submitted affidavits alleging the weapon may have been planted after the shooting. Some claimed they were asked to bring a throwaway or drop gun to the scene, an extra weapon that could be used to justify the use of lethal force after the fact. If those claims were true, the physical evidence that supported the original police narrative would have been fundamentally compromised. The dispute over that single rifle would eventually lead to one of the most unusual criminal prosecutions of police officers in Australia. Graeme Jensen was 33 years old when he died that afternoon. Police had been monitoring him for some time as a suspected participant in armed robberies linked to Melbourne's criminal underworld. On the day of the shooting, Jensen had reportedly stopped while driving through Narre Warren to buy a spark plug. Detectives from the armed robbery squad moved in to intercept him during that errand. Several unmarked police vehicles converged around Jensen's car in what officers described as a coordinated arrest attempt. Within seconds of surrounding the vehicle, shots were fired. Jensen was struck by gunfire and died inside the car. Detectives later reported that they believed Jensen had access to a weapon, pointing to the sawn-off rifle found in the vehicle after the shooting. For a period following the incident, that explanation remained the accepted account of what had happened. However, other developments soon complicated the narrative surrounding Jensen. At the time of his death, police suspected him of involvement in several violent crimes, including a murder investigation. After Jensen was killed, forensic testing was conducted on blood evidence recovered from that murder scene. The results showed the blood sample did not match Jensen, effectively clearing him of involvement in that particular killing. While he had been under investigation for armed robberies, the discovery demonstrated that at least one of the most serious crimes linked to his name had been based on incorrect assumptions. This development added another layer of uncertainty to the events surrounding the fatal police operation. In the early 1990s, Victoria police were already facing increasing scrutiny over allegations of misconduct within certain specialized squads. Investigations into those claims brought renewed attention to the Jensen shooting. When former detectives began alleging that the rifle recovered from Jensen's car might have been planted, authorities launched a criminal investigation into the officers involved in the operation. The accusations were serious. Prosecutors alleged that members of the police team might have manipulated the evidence at the scene to justify the shooting. The investigation eventually resulted in criminal charges. In 1993, prosecutors charged 9 police officers connected to the incident. Most of those accused were members of the Armed Robbery Squad, the unit responsible for investigating violent robberies across Victoria. Among those charged was Detective John Hill from the Homicide Squad, who had been involved in the investigation following Jensen's death. The charges included murder and related offenses, reflecting the prosecution's argument that Jensen had been unlawfully killed and that the evidence surrounding the shooting had been misrepresented. Charging such a large number of detectives in a single case was extremely rare and immediately attracted national attention. Shortly after the charges were laid, tragedy struck one of the accused officers. Detective John Hill died by suicide in 1993, not long after the legal proceedings began. His death meant the allegations against him were never examined in court. The remaining prosecutions continued through the legal system as authorities attempted to determine what had happened during the fatal operation in Narre Warren. As the case progressed, many of the original charges were dismissed or withdrawn during preliminary hearings. Courts carefully evaluated the evidence and testimony presented by prosecutors. Reconstructing the events of the shooting proved difficult. The case depended heavily on witness accounts from officers who had been present during the same operation. as well as statements from former detectives who had come forward years later with allegations about the rifle found in Jensen's car. Over time, the number of cases moving toward trial narrowed significantly. Ultimately, only one officer proceeded to a full trial. That officer was Detective Robert Hill, a member of the armed robbery squad who had fired the fatal shot that killed Jensen. By the time the case reached court in 1995, it had become one of the most closely watched prosecutions involving police conduct in Victoria's history. Prosecutors argued that Jensen had not posed the threat described in the original police reports and that the rifle found in the vehicle may have been planted after he had been shot. Defense lawyers challenged those claims and argued that the officers had acted lawfully during a dangerous arrest attempt involving a suspected armed robber. After hearing the evidence presented by both sides, the jury deliberated for only a short period. Robert Hill was acquitted in less than 20 minutes, bringing the criminal proceedings connected to Jensen's death to an end. No police officers were convicted in connection with the shooting. Despite the controversy surrounding the case, Robert Hill remained with Victoria Police after the trial. Over the following years, he continued his career within the force and eventually rose through the ranks. Hill later became an assistant commissioner in Victoria Police, placing him among the senior leadership of the organization. His career progression remained one of the notable aspects of the case's aftermath. That's all for today's video. Thanks for being part of the journey. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss what we bring next.